Thank you. I'd like to start out by saying, actually I should start out by saying, is the microphone okay in the back? Go. All right. So let me start really by saying thank you so much, Dr. Wiese, for the invitation, and to the Rutland Institute, and to my colleague Tracy Arwood in the Research Ethics Office. So I'm delighted to be able to speak with you tonight, and hope that we can have an interesting dialogue perhaps about some of the issues and challenges in public consideration of animal research. What I'll give you is very much a scientist perspective, so how scientists navigate these challenges, how we think about them, some of the regulatory system and formal systems that are in place for thinking about ethics in the context of animal research. What I'll point out throughout the evening is that we really can't separate out non-human animal and human research. They go together for some very important reasons. But they're issues that the public is deeply engaged in and often quite interested in thinking about. So let me begin with some disclosures. So first of all, I speak only for myself. Even the things I say I wish I hadn't said, those are just me. But some of my perspective. So I'm a scientist, as Dan said. I'm also an educator. So that means I teach college students, I teach at the university level, but I also engage in public outreach. So I think part of a public scientist's moral obligation is to talk to the public and talk with the public about some of the pressing issues of our day, to try and communicate and share what it is we're doing. I'm an advocate for research, so I like to talk about why we do research. I like to offer dialogue with people who are interested in it. But I'm also an advocate for animal welfare. So studies in my laboratory are meant to be policy relevant and take psychological science and use it to inform better care and practices for animals in all forms of captive settings. I'm also a mom, a daughter, a sister. I have relationships with people in my life whose health I care about, and I care about the health of the broader public as well. So like all of you in the audience, I think we care about human health, we care about animal health, society, and global health. And these kinds of feelings and care inform many of the decisions that we make. I, as many scientists, believe that all of us benefit from humanely conducted ethical animal research, that it informs scientific progress, that it informs betterment of animal and human lives, of society, and of the globe. In large part, this is because we can look to history and see examples of exactly that. We know that animal research has played a role in improvements across the globe for both humans and for other animals. So you see the cat here on the left benefiting from medical technology. That's often the case. And the examples I'll use tonight will speak to this. When we look at history, we can see all kinds of medical progress. So we see vaccines for things like polio, hepatitis. We see chronic health threats that may not have been solved, but have been improved and addressed critically by medical and scientific research. So cancer isn't cured for the most part, but the treatments are a great deal better. Survival times are longer, suffering is reduced. In large part, this history is because scientific research has produced a better understanding of our bodies, of biology, a better understanding of the brain. We've gone from seeing this blob of tissue that some of you study in physiological psychology to understanding that there are different parts of the brain, understanding how it works, what kinds of behaviors and processes they're associated with. And we've made a great deal of progress in understanding behavior of ourselves and of other animals. So I'll end tonight with talking about some great ape work, chimpanzee work, research that literally has taught us about the cognitive, emotional, and social capacities of chimpanzees and other animals. What I hope that I'll convince you of, if you aren't already, and many of you probably are, is it's both this basic science, basic understanding, and clinical research or translational applied research that lead to improvements in the health of humans, animals, and society. So we see it in these older examples. So how many of you remember polio? Just a few, right? So there was a breakthrough, a polio vaccine. That vaccine, its development was built upon many, many years of basic knowledge of bodies, of brains, of cells, of immunity. That vaccine changed the course of history, not only for humans, but what might be less known is for other animals, including chimpanzees. Many of you are familiar with Jane Goodall, the Gombe chimpanzees. So famous chimpanzees in Africa were threatened with polio, just as humans were. Jane Goodall, a famous conservationist, used the polio vaccine to protect those animals. That's not an old situation. So if I ask how many of you know about Ebola, I think everyone would raise their hands. So we have both past events that tell us about health and medicine. We have current and emerging threats to health. I say that by way of conveying that everything isn't solved, everything isn't done, all the health challenges that remain, we can't know about. What we do know is the world changes, new threats emerge, and scientific research stands to address some of them. We see that with Zika virus. We see that with cancer. So medical research has given us new discoveries to address illnesses like cancer. You see some of them there, but again, not solved yet. We see breakthroughs in things like tissue engineering, so literally making new organs, making new skin, being able to address critical problems for people who have lost organs, lost limbs, lost skin. These breakthroughs are not always to the clinic yet. They're not always in wide use like the polio vaccine, but they're important and they're on the threshold of doing that. We see that in things like neural prosthetics, so things like cochlear implants, things like controlling artificial limbs through using brain signals. We see that those are important, particularly for our troops, so wounded warriors, people who can be benefited by having neural prostheses. All of this work is built on the basic science that told us about how the brain works and allowed us to produce new treatments. Deep brain stimulation, another one. So a treatment that is going into use for Parkinson's disease. This is work where a patient has an implant. It can stimulate a specific part of the brain and address the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. This is an important treatment. It's one that involved a lot of non-human primates, monkeys, in its development, both to understand parts of the brain and understand how they're involved in Parkinson's-like syndromes. We have gene therapies that are used to address retinal disease, that are being used to address some forms of hereditary diseases. And then we have areas that are relatively new, like epigenetics. So understanding literally how genes turn on and off because of things that happen to individuals, because of their environments. So we don't have a static view of genes anymore. All of this because of scientific research and in part because of animal studies. So as a scientist, when I look at that, I think the future of animal research should be continued scientific progress, continued medical advances that benefit everyone, breakthroughs in prevention, treatment, and intervention. At the same time, those benefits and that bright future is balanced. And it's balanced for scientists doing animal research and for the public that considers the ethical issues with what we acknowledge as our moral obligation to the humane treatment of the animals that are in our studies. So regardless of the species that we use for the most part, and in the US, the majority of animal research, about 96%, is with mice and rats and other rodents. We care about their welfare and their well-being. They receive moral consideration. This consideration or this ethical issue is instantiated in our regulatory system. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the laws and regulations and then refer you to your experts. What point I want to make here is our framework for thinking about ethics in animal research is well developed and quite old. So it goes well before laws and formal legislation, well before anyone thought about things like ALAC, USDA, and all the agencies we engage with. It started in the 1900s with scientists who themselves developed moral codes or procedures for the humane treatment of animals. That continued for many years. So we see a group I'm part of, the American Psychological Association's Committee on Animal Research Ethics, or CARE, began in 1925. Again, it was scientists who wanted, as a community, to think about the ethical issues about the humane and moral treatment of animals. That continued on in the 1960s. We have US legislation, the Animal Welfare Act, and there are many iterations afterwards. If you're interested in reading more about regulation, there's a lot of information out there, and I would really encourage you, if you're interested in this issue, to actually go read a little bit more if you don't already know it. If you're one of the people that teaches in this domain, some really good references. It turns out that most of the public isn't walking around reading about animal research regulation, and frankly, it can be a little bit boring, but the information is out there. A take-home message on that front is all of the animals in publicly funded research at Clemson, at any university, are governed by federal agencies. So there are two of them. There's the NIH's Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. There's the United States Department of Agriculture. So we have federal agencies that are also involved in oversight and enforcement of the federal laws. If you read through all those regulations, what you will find is they really center around a few basic principles. So the public has decided that animals in research, or animal research and testing, should only be conducted when there are no other viable alternatives to accomplish the same purpose or goal, and when the potential benefits outweigh the potential risk or harms. At the very same time, when there are no alternatives, when the potential risks are lower than the potential harms, animal welfare must be protected in specific ways. So we must strive to reduce any pain or suffering, for example. So that's our regulatory system. It's under that system and with that basic ethical approach that the majority of scientists, the community of scientists, believe that it is appropriate to use animals in scientific research. That's about 93% of scientists, and that's all scientists, not just those working in animal research. But you might be aware that there are people who disagree with that point of view entirely, who find that animal research is not morally justified and not ethical. This is a few of the groups that hold that position. You may be familiar with some of them. Probably PETA might ring a bell. Probably not some of the other ones. There are a fair number in the US and abroad. So what is the position of these different groups? Well, that's kind of like saying, what is philosophy, right? So there are many different kinds of reasons one might be opposed to the use of animals in research. I'm not going to try to represent every possible position. I'm going to go over some of the big ideas and where I think we have intersections. So one position is that animals have rights, and it boils down to the principle that a mouse is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. It's a famous statement by the person who developed the group PETA. And the idea is that animals should have the same rights as us, and we do not have the right to use them as our property or make decisions for them. Now that's a little bit different from what we would call an animal welfare perspective. So all of us, I believe would share an animal welfare perspective. We're concerned about animals' welfare. That doesn't lead one to necessarily be opposed to animal research. So animal welfare, different thing from animal rights or people who are opposed to all use of animals by humans, but not from an animal rights position. So this is a simple way to think about some of those perspectives. What I will say is I think the public should be engaged in considering these points of view. And I'll tell you a little bit about why I think that is. So there are many different groups that are opposed to the use of animals by humans, and they have a range of strategies to try to convey to others why they should believe this as well. So those can include campaigns aimed at changing public opinion. How many of you have seen a campaign by PETA, for example? I'm looking at the student area. Wait. Okay. So Facebook, the blogosphere, Twitter, social media, mainstream media, billboards, buses. There's a lot of messaging out there from groups like PETA that's aimed at changing public opinion. There are campaigns about harassment and intimidation, trying to change scientists' willingness to do science. And increasingly campaigns aimed at legislation, campaigns aimed at increasing regulatory burden. In part, the breadth of these campaigns reflects the fact that in the US, animal rights groups have been around for a long time. 30, 60 years. They're very well funded, sometimes budgets of millions of dollars, and they have a lot of different emphasis. So here's a montage showing some of the international campaigns against the use of animals by humans, and that includes a lot of different uses. That includes, for example, eating meat, but is often conflated with the use of animals in research. So these are billboards that were placed near a university complaining about their animal research. These are political campaigns, so often suggesting to our legislators that we end the use of animals by humans. And you see them on a lot of different fronts. When we think about the legislative front, that may seem really distant. I'll suggest that it has immediate public significance. What people sometimes think less about are campaigns of harassment and intimidation. So campaigns like this. This is a set of postcards I once received from an animal rights group. This is one of my colleagues' car on fire at UCLA. These are called intimidation tactics, and they are meant to discourage scientists from conducting animal research. What I'll suggest to you is that all of those things together, and I've gone through it very quickly, contribute to the climate in which science occurs in the US and abroad. And that's an important thing to the public that benefits from the science and that cares about the science. And I think that's part of the public responsibility in this picture. So we have scientists performing their work for public benefit. We have the scientists under pressure from a variety of sources that include campaigns by people opposed to the use of animals. So harassment campaigns, but also increasing pressures via regulation that ultimately is sometimes the result of failure to think carefully about what's already in place for the regulation and for ethical consideration of animal research. So why I think the broad public should care about this as well is that what's at stake when we have scientists working in that kind of realm is literally the future of science. So the future of scientific discoveries, those I've shown you, that benefit humans, animals, and the environment. And for compassionate people, this is of a concern. So we care about global health. If we're jeopardizing the science that can improve public health, from a place of compassion, we should care and perhaps engage thoughtfully on that. So you might be thinking, well, scientists are the ones who decide whether or not to conduct science. They're the ones in charge of what animal research is done. That actually isn't the case at all. So in the US, in a democracy, animal research, like everything else, depends on a social contract. So what does the public think about animal research becomes the most relevant question. These are some current polling data. What you can see there is that in many polls, support for animal research has dropped below 50%. And that should concern all of us. As a scientist, it concerns me because I wonder if part of that is a failure of understanding what the science is, how it's regulated, why we believe it's ethical. But ultimately, the public can decide we won't have animal research. As a scientist, as an educator, as someone who cares about public health, my question would be, do people know what the likely consequences would be of that set of decisions? Have we thought carefully about who would be affected by that decision? And if all else fails, this is usually my answer. So this is not one of those issues we want to just ignore. So do you think anyone does ignore it? Well, I'm going to tell you that people do. So people think it isn't their issue, or maybe they can ignore it. I saw an example of this in a book that was read on this campus. So it's a novel. The protagonist of the novel is a girl whose parents were psychologists, which that's always a bad thing, right? And we're raising a chimpanzee in the home. To summarize a very nice novel very, very briefly, the protagonist grows up, her brother becomes an animal liberationist, and she's wrestling with the ethical questions surrounding animal research. At one point, she makes this comment, "I didn't want to live in a world where I had to choose between a blind human baby and a tortured monkey. To be frank, that's the sort of choice I expect science to protect me from. I handled the situation by not reading more." And I chose this particular statement because I thought it really captured what many people would like to do, which is not engage with the difficult choices, ethical dilemmas, and moral questions that are inherent in science and that scientists do engage with. So another way to think about this might be this. This is my attempt at philosophy. It might not go well. But this is what's called the trolley car experiment. It's used in psychology to assess people's moral reasoning. So how do you make decisions about complicated moral things? You have a trolley, it's coming down the track. If you do nothing, it's going to kill 5 people, the big black dot there. But you can pull a switch, and then the trolley will come this way, and it'll only kill 1 person. So this is the trolley car. There are many, many different versions of this. But what you have really is on one side, do nothing, 5 people die, but it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything. On the other side, you can take action, do something. A person will die because of your action, but 5 people will be solved. So one way that I sometimes think about scientists is we're a community, and we're a community along with the public trying to make choices that we believe are morally, ethically correct, that are undertaken for the greater good for the public, but we don't do that alone. We are the ones who maybe metaphorically can pull that switch and do something. But it really depends on the public and society that allows that action, that expects that from us, and ultimately that benefits. So it's one way to think about this process and the public partnership with scientists that supports animal research, but really any kind of research. So no doubt, the use of animals in research is complex, it's emotional, it's controversial, and it merits the kind of dialogue that all complex issues merit. one that's based in facts, in accurate information and consideration, in full consideration of the likely consequences of both action or failure to act. So as you think about it, what you might think about is, well, what do I need to know? What do we need to know in order to make the decisions? What matters? How do we arbitrate differences? People don't agree. How should we navigate that? One way to get through that issue or to think about that issue productively can be to start at the very beginning. So start with, what are the fundamental assumptions in ethical consideration of the use of non-human animals by humans, period? So we've presented two positions. I think probably no one in this room is on either of these extremes. So if we think about all the uses of animals by humans, an absolutist view would be any and all use of animals is okay, regardless of alternatives, purpose, consequences. Does anyone believe that? No. We could also say no use of animals is ever okay, regardless of consequences. Well, anyone believe that? No. So it's far more nuanced. I'm going to go through a series of photographs. I just want you to have an emotional opinion. You're going to think different things about what these photographs portray. Whether you thought those were acceptable or not probably depended on a number of factors. It depended on what the purpose was, whether there was an alternative, what was the benefit, was the animal suffering or in pain. In the US, there is one use of animals by humans that is subject to a formal legal ethical requirement for ethical review, and that is animal research. So despite the fact that animals in research are an incredibly small number of all animals used by humans, we have a formal system that asks us to weigh the potential benefits and the potential harms and allow that to inform our decisions. That process occurs at multiple levels. So I'm representing a few of them here to show you how scientists view this perspective. So at the level of the researcher's selection of questions, of methods, there's a formal consideration of harm and benefit that occurs via funding agencies. So the public agencies that fund our research, the National Institutes of Health, have expert scientific review. Part of what they consider is harm benefit. It occurs in our institutional animal care and use committees. It occurs by our external public agencies. In other words, there are a number of places where this harm benefit analysis is considered. The factors that play a role in that harm benefit analysis are many. So here are a few of them. I'll walk through a couple, but I think we can realize it's a complex issue. So some of the primary ones would include things like, who are the interest holders? So who stands to be harmed? Who stands to benefit? So it may be humans benefit, animals absorb the risk. Or it may be some humans benefit, others absorb the risk. This is our basic framework for thinking about ethics. And when we think about the benefits, we think about not just, is a new drug going to be developed or will there be a treatment tomorrow, but rather we think about basic building blocks of knowledge that produce a benefit. When we think about harms, we think about things like potential for pain, for death, for suffering. And those work both ways. So we might think about the potential harm an experiment would result in, but we also think about the harm that would be avoided if a new treatment were discovered. So it's a broad and inclusive ethical consideration, moving across ranges of interest holders. So what is morally justifiable becomes a question in part in our current system of, does the benefit outweigh the harms? The issue is, you don't know the answer ahead of doing the experiment, right? So if you're a scientist and you propose to do an experiment, you don't already know the answer. If you did, you wouldn't have to do the experiment. So it becomes this situation where you're evaluating the potential benefit and the potential risk ahead of doing the experiment, which of course means it won't always work, because it doesn't always work. Your studies don't always succeed. You don't always find what you hope for. So how do you navigate that? So here's where I'd like to go into a little bit of history, because of course if we can't know about the future, what we can do is look back and see what we have learned, gather information about what was successful, what paid off, what didn't, and use that knowledge to inform our decisions. Some of the things we can learn about include the time windows. So how long does it take for an experiment to result in some kind of substantial progress? How many people are impacted? So let's do a little bit of history here. So I'll start in the 1920s. So we've got Babe Ruth playing baseball. History buffs can correct me if I get any of this wrong. Calvin Coolidge is president. We've got Prohibition. We've got Lindbergh going across transatlantic flight. Treatment of animals. We've got a pet chimpanzee at the Scopes trial. We've got big game hunting in Africa. This is a zoo. From a medical perspective, we still had heroin and cough syrup. This is an X-ray machine. We had heart disease as a leading cause of death. Cancer was becoming one, but it was alternating with pneumonia and influenza. On the scientific side, here's where we were. We had Otto Loy, who was discovering chemical neurotransmission. So the idea that there were chemicals and they influenced the organs' functions. How did he do that? He had some frogs, and he had the frog hearts, which released a substance. He could move that from one to the other and showed there were chemical properties that allowed the heart to beat. He discovered chemical neurotransmission. So that was pretty important, and that was important because it contributed to our knowledge of how the brain and the body work. It helped us then to investigate the cause of diseases, and eventually helped us to design drugs and therapies. So question becomes, was it morally justifiable to use those frogs? This is one of the questions we can ask post hoc with the benefit of knowing what happened next. Of course, some of you may not care so much about frogs, right? I do, but. So we could say instead, what about dogs? What about cows? What about rabbits? And we could take another example. So insulin. Insulin was an important discovery. The prognosis for people with diabetes, say type 1 childhood diabetes, was not good prior to the discovery of insulin, not good at all. So if we look at a patient before and after treatment of insulin, I think we can agree that suffering was reduced, and that discovery of insulin, moving it into treatment, was a good thing. How did that happen? The causal mechanism for diabetes was discovered in part through the use of dogs in research by scientists who removed the pancreas from a dog. Dog developed symptom of diabetes. Identifies causal mechanism, insulin produced by pancreas. What happened next, a 40-year period, is discovery of insulin's role in diabetes, synthesizing insulin, testing it for safety, purity and dose in rabbits, and then distributing it to the public. It wasn't until the late 1970s that synthetic insulin became available. So again, the question is, was it morally justifiable? We can look at the number of people that have diabetes that stand to benefit and are benefiting from the discovery of insulin. It's not a small number. But we can also see that it was not just humans that benefited from the discovery. In fact, many of you probably know of a pet or someone else's pet, or a chimpanzee in a zoo or some other setting that also has diabetes and benefits from insulin. So you may be thinking, well, but that was in old times, and now there are probably alternatives. Or maybe there were alternatives then. But in fact, consideration of alternatives is also a critical part of the ethical framework governing animal research. And in fact, scientists do already use alternatives. They use many models to move scientific understanding forward. So if there's an alternative, it's used. Scientists are also the ones developing those alternatives. But there are many cases where, sadly, there are not yet alternatives for invasive research. So in vitro studies or cell-based studies don't work for everything. We need whole systems for many kinds of research questions. Human studies play an important role in medical progress, but they also do not provide everything that we need. One point that remains poorly understood and that is really important when we're talking about alternatives is also the difference between animal testing and animal research. So animal testing is what people think about oftentimes. They're thinking about big drug companies testing, oftentimes cosmetics or drugs, before they're given to humans. That's one use of animals in the medical realm, but it's not the same as research. So animal research is the more basic work, probably the work that goes on in most universities. It's building block kind of research or blue sky science, trying to figure out how things work. We typically do not have alternatives for those. So while we have seen that animal testing can be reduced through some use of alternatives, that's often not the case for basic research. And without that basic research, you end discovery. So I'll give an example that highlights the interplay between that basic blue sky science and animal testing. So this time into the 1930s. So we see it's the Great Depression, women have received the vote. This is what treatment for psychiatric disorders often looked like. So this is an electric shock therapy. When we move into the 1940s to 60s, we see the advent of surgeries, things like frontal lobotomy. One flew over the cuckoo's nest, anyone? Okay. So a brain surgery that turned out not to be so good. We saw through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s that an increasing number of people were institutionalized, so basically put in insane asylums, as they were called. By 1955, well over 500,000 people were in these institutions without effective drug therapies, without rehabilitation. It's worth pausing to consider that if we're talking about suffering or harm, the people that were suffering in these places were not the only ones affected. So there were also parents, siblings, children, relatives, and friends of these patients who suffered because of the lack of treatments. So if we look through, this is a status of treatment for psychiatric disorders. What changed? What changed in large part were breakthroughs in understanding brain chemistry. So here's neurochemistry. How do we know? All of you probably have heard about serotonin. We didn't always know that. How we learned about that was also in the 1930s. A scientist named Erspemer was interested in why smooth muscles contract. Does that sound like depression, schizophrenia, or mental health? Not so much. So he's studying blood, again in frogs. He discovers a substance that's involved in smooth muscle contraction. Over the next 20 years, that substance its structure was determined, it was refined, it was synthesized, which meant it could be used in research. But still, we don't seem to have a link to mental health. What changed was the discovery of serotonin in mammalian brain. And that was by a scientist named Betty Turang, who, using dogs and rabbits, frogs and clams in her research, found serotonin was acting in the brain. She wasn't trying to generate a cure for depression, but her work provided the critical building block for someone else to hypothesize that perhaps psychoses, things like depression, weren't caused by demons, weren't caused purely by what were called refrigerator mothers or genetics, but actually it was the chemistry in the brain that was influencing the disorder. And that provided the basic information that was needed for something called targeted pharmacotherapies, or development of drugs that could target a particular neurotransmitter and alleviate the problems associated with deficits. By 2012, antidepressants were the second most commonly prescribed drug in the US. Now, people will argue that that's because it's too commonly prescribed and we have a problem about that. This may well be. But what I would caution people to think about is what was happening before and about the suffering that was undeniably relieved by the advent of those drugs. So nothing is perfect, but that was important. So when we think about those kinds of examples, what we can say to ourselves, so there's no right answer here, everyone might have a different perspective, but we can use those examples to plug into a model for thinking about harm, benefit, across all the different interest holders. So the dog, the rabbit, the cow, the monkey, the species, society, humans, and the environment. What we can also say from looking at that kind of history is when we look back in time, it becomes quite clear that the number of interest holders who will be affected by the science might be much bigger than what we think at the get-go. And it might take much, much longer for that benefit to be realized than we think. So the discovery of serotonin, the range of impact is huge. So serotonin is involved in sleep, eating, mental health disorders, a wide variety of issues. Discovering that chemical had a huge range of impact. Literally everything that came after it depended upon it. The picture might be conveyed in this way. So the further we get in time from the discovery, the larger the range of impact. So estimating how much benefit was produced right down here will give us a very incomplete picture. So at this point, you might be thinking, that is super complicated. I think that it is very difficult to know what decisions one should make ahead of doing the work. But what we have in our system for ethical oversight and review, what we have within our communities, are ways for people with scientific expertise to think about how much a particular gap of knowledge might mean to a field, how much a gap in knowledge is limiting progress. And it's that kind of specialty expertise that plays a role in the harm-benefit equation, or in weighing what we should do and not do. So scientists are integrally involved in this process. They may not always talk about it in the same way, but that's the framework, and that's what scientists are doing. What's also true, though, is the public has an obligation to be a part of that process, because ultimately it's publicly funded research. It's the public that decides what we do and don't do. So when there are no alternatives at all, what is it we should do becomes the question. And again, that's a question for scientists, but it's a question for the public at the same time. What I'll say about science is, although we can use the retrospectoscope to see what happened and what happened next, science itself moves forward. So it's a dynamic process. If you already know the answer to something, you tend not to do it again and again, which replication, super important thing. So those of you who are students have learned that. But science keeps moving forward. And as questions are answered, the science moves on. As new methods and techniques are developed, the science moves on. So what happened yesterday, what happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, probably is not the case today. Brain imaging is just one example. So back prior to 1972, there was no MRI machine. If you wanted to get in the brain, there were only a few ways to do it. At this point, in my own research, for example, we use brain imaging. So many of you might have had an MRI. We do the same thing with non-human primates in order to learn about the brain. That's an example of science and technologies moving on. So I think this kind of a comment, and I bring it back for a reason, is sad. And I found and often find that people sometimes do decide not to read more. So they read about chimpanzee experiments or monkey experiments from many, many decades ago, and they go on with the impression that it's exactly the same today. So I'm going to end with a series of slides about chimpanzees, and I hope convey a little bit about why I think it's important to keep reading and keep thinking about these issues, both the historical ones and the future ones, and use that to inform what it is you think about the ethics of research, including chimpanzee research. So in this book, the protagonist's parents are raising a chimpanzee alongside she and her brother. They want to learn about ape language. There were several studies like this back in the 20s, 30s, continuing into the 60s. And the idea was, how do we learn about these animals? Communicating with them would give us great advances. We saw the same thing on the dolphin research front. So wouldn't it be amazing to be able to talk with a chimpanzee? That'd be pretty cool. That was the idea. So we saw 1930s. But let's set the context, the historical context appropriately too. So this is also the time when people would go to Africa and kill these animals. That was the time when these animals would be imported into European and American zoos. So 1930s zoo, 1930s zoo in London. These are clearly docile animals because people are allowing their children to play with them. Apes in entertainment was a thing and continues to be a thing. So again, 1930s, 1940s, the film industry, 1950s, a zoo. 1960s, a chimpanzee was first to be sent into space. So some monkeys and a chimpanzee. So this is the historical context. On the research, I'll cover the research side in two parts. One that you might be most familiar with actually began in the 1980s and crescendoed in the last several years. So in the 1980s, there was a virus called AIDS. People were very afraid. People were dying. Not much was known. The nation's medical and scientific leadership believed that it was important to do something, to learn about this virus, to try to prevent it, to have treatments, perhaps a vaccine. At that time, people believed the need was dire, and the closest to human model that would be useful would be chimpanzees. So primate centers across America, several of them, produced many, many research chimpanzees for the research. This was the context. People wanted research to address human suffering. HIV/AIDS is still a global problem of significant import. There are treatments, there are drug treatments that can reduce, extend lives and reduce suffering, but still a global problem. On the chimpanzee research front, important things were learned. But it turned out that chimpanzees were not the necessary model for the work. And in fact, the work continues today in many primate centers. Monkeys and other animals alongside alternatives are used. For other research, so that some would consider a failure. For other research, hepatitis, for example, it turned out chimpanzees were the best model. And a great deal of productive research was done that led to advances in treatment for hepatitis. But that work ended. That work ended in the last several years, in part through a complex set of political, social, and scientific considerations in which chimpanzee research itself, this headline says, was put on trial, but was reconsidered by the major funding industry of our country, the National Institutes of Health. I'm going to ask you a different question than the medical one, though, which is, what has changed and why, and how did research play a role? So some people have attributed this change to people with an animal rights point of view winning a victory. What essentially happened is NIH decided it would not perform chimpanzee biomedical invasive research anymore. That was perceived as a victory. I don't think that's quite the right way to look at it, though. And I think, in part, what we have to also ask is, how did that change? And why? And in part, it was through basic science. So I would argue that it was actually a lot of the basic behavioral, cognitive, and neural work that changed the way we as scientists and the way you as the public think about chimpanzees. So we see that turn of the century in Russia. We see that in 1925, a German scientist who discovered chimpanzees' insight learning. Robert Yerkes, a famous primatologist in America who set up the Yale Biology Lab with chimpanzees, who produced some of the very first writing, extensive knowledge about the biology and behavior of chimpanzees. Of course, there was the ape language work. There were a number of different projects seeking to communicate with apes. It was broader than that, so you see work with monkeys that essentially changed our thinking about monkeys and other animals from automaton or robots to creatures that are capable of higher cognition, learning, insight than we had thought of before. Fieldwork played a role in that as well. So you see Jane Goodall's field studies. You see field studies that told us about infanticide, aggression, and hunting. So it wasn't all roses. In the 1970s and forward, with technology, so just like MRI changed how we know about the brain, computers, okay, the students are going to laugh at this, but there was like Atari and like primitive video games. These technologies actually totally changed behavioral research in many ways, because it meant you could ask chimpanzees to talk to you using communication devices like symbol boards. This is work in Atlanta at the Georgia State University Language Research Center. That work continues today. So, for example, in Des Moines, Iowa, at the Ape Cognition and Conservation Initiative, where an ape named Kanzi and his group communicate via symbol boards. In Kyoto, Japan, where again, the animals are capable of playing video games to tell us about their learning, their memory, and their insight. So you might be thinking, well, that sounds okay, but how are they treated? So these are photographs of different places chimpanzees live in the US. I think, to me, they convey a care about the animals, about their surroundings, about their environment. This represents research, dedicated research facilities, the Yerkes Primate Center, for example, but also zoos and sanctuaries. The past, so all of that basic research with chimpanzees is what drove, in large part, how we care about those animals and how we care for those animals. So it's that kind of work that I think has played a large role in informing our ethical consideration. Which is why when people talk about wanting to end animal research as a goal, I often think we need to know what the consequence would be. So what would happen as a result of that choice? And I think we need to think very carefully about the fact that research is one of the major ways we learn about our world. So if we quit doing research in all its different forms, in many ways we will end paths to discovery that allow us to address challenges that are of deep significance to ourselves, to society, to the globe, to humans, but to other animals as well. And it's that kind of risk-benefit analysis that we think about when scientists are thinking about the issues, but also one that the public, I think, shares with us. So I would welcome you, and I know many of you do think about these issues. That's my perspective on it, and I think one that scientists share in hoping that the public will partner with them to have informed dialogues that really consider these are challenging issues, but having an accurate understanding and knowledge of the consequences of decisions becomes very important. So I'll end there, And thank you for your attention, and ask if you have any questions.